Good morning, good afternoon, good evening today. My name is Stephen Cook, and I'm director of the Canadian Centre. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first Collaboration for Environmental Evidence webinar series. So back in June, we intend to host the Environmental Evidence Summit for Environmental Evidence, but due to the pandemic, we had pulled that event. In lieu of that, we've tried to figure out ways of engaging our continuing to build capacity for evidence-based conservation. And that brings us to today, a webinar, the first of several webinars that will be hosted over the next several months. I'd like to thank a few people. First of all, Jessica and Trina from the Canadian Centre here at Carleton University in Ottawa. They have been instrumental in pulling together this series. I also want to acknowledge the meetings committee, as well as the various organizers. Today, the chairs are Karen Smogrowski and Amanda, both from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, but everybody's willingness to pivot and work to develop online content. So we hope that you will find this to be useful. We certainly are looking forward to your feedback. As I noted, this is our first one. We want to do this. This is for you, an opportunity for you to learn and engage. So please provide us with feedback in terms of what we can improve for the future. I just want to note that this is really, I think, an opportune time for us to be thinking about, certainly in our pandemic world right now. This is something newspaper almost on a daily basis, and of course,
Okay, I think we've lost Steve.
I think you're good to get started, Karen.
Okay. So hopefully my internet's a little bit better. Steve is known to be in a location of some patchy internet, but I'd like to say hello to everyone and thank you all for attending. Today, myself and Amanda Weingardner are pleased to be co-chairs of this first in the series of webinars, and we look forward to attending other ones as well. We will be focusing on how the Canadian government incorporates science into decision-making and recent efforts to incorporate systematic literature reviews into that evidence base that feeds into decisions. You'll be hearing 5 presentations that will summarize results or progress on systematic literature reviews that were commissioned by the federal government. And we added 2 talks into our webinar that are of a similar topic that could provide tools to help improve incorporation of evidence into decisions in various governments globally. Finally, I will present the system Fisheries and Oceans Canada uses to try to improve the transfer of science to decision makers and our internal client sectors. And Amanda will be co-presenting a talk covering examples of some uptake of science advice into decisions at DFO. After all the presentations are complete, we'll have a brief break and followed by a panel discussion session. And that will be led by Amanda Weingardner, and I'll let her introduce that at the time. So there's a few logistical notes. Attendees can't unmute their own microphones, and the hand raise feature will not be used today. So if you have a question, we ask that you use the question box as part of your control panel. And we will be monitoring that question box. At the end of every speaker, there should be an opportunity to ask questions, but For the presentations, I'll be asking the questions verbally to everyone, and for the panel, Amanda will be. And if anyone has trouble seeing the presentation, try to turn your GoToWebinar on full screen, because that sometimes seems to solve the problem. So, without further delay, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So today, Dr. Trina Rutwinski, she is going to be speaking on what are the impacts of flow regime changes on fish productivity in temperate regions, a systematic map. Dr. Rutwinski is a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation at Carleton University, and she has been instrumental in guiding a lot of the systematic reviews and meta-analysis you'll actually be seeing today. So without further ado, Trina, over to you.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. Okay, so the focus of this presentation, having this problem, is the results of a recently completed systematic map on the impacts of flow regime changes on fish productivity, as Karen mentioned. So this map was commissioned by one of our Canadian federal government agencies, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So for those who may not be familiar with the difference between a systematic map and a systematic review, a systematic map asks how much and what type of evidence exists rather than what does the evidence suggest. So the purpose of a map is to provide an overview of the available evidence on a particular topic. And it's really great for identifying subtopics that are sufficiently covered by existing studies to allow full systematic reviewing. We often refer to these as evidence clusters, and they're also great for identifying subtopics requiring further primary research, also known as knowledge gaps. So because there's 4 of us or 5 of us that are going to be presenting all from the same center, we don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of all of our details of our methods. So I just wanted to quickly go over the process that we all follow for our reviews. We all try to follow the guidelines and standards set out by the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence as much as possible. So it begins with question formulation. Often these are brought to us by our commissioning bodies, like the DFO, for example. Together we've developed and formed an advisory team made of people on the commissioning body, other stakeholders, review experts, as well as topic experts. And together we come up with a protocol or the project plan of how we're going to undertake the review itself. Once that's established and published, undergoes peer review, we then actually start the process of searching, article screening, data extraction, critical appraisal in the case of systematic reviews, and then the actual synthesis. So for this systematic map, we included any freshwater estuarine fish species in temperate regions. In terms of the intervention we were interested in, we were looking at changes to or manipulations of flow regime from anthropogenic or natural causes. So changes in flow regime could be a component such as flow duration, frequency, magnitude, rate of change, for example. Anthropogenic causes could be dams with no hydroelectric facilities, dams with hydroelectric facilities, land use changes, water withdrawal and abstraction, for example. And then natural causes could be floods, droughts, seasonal changes, and climate change. We did not restrict studies to include a comparator for this map, and because of the broad scope of this review, we had a broad definition of outcomes to include. So any change in a component of fish productivity was included. You may not be able to read the numbers in here. That's okay. I don't want to focus too much on this. I just wanted to highlight the size of the evidence base for this topic. It was very large and massive. Just using 6 publication databases and 1 search engine. At the very beginning, we started with just over 25,000 hits. Through our inclusion and screening process, in the end, we included 1,368 studies from just under 2,000 articles. Okay, jumping right into some results. Most studies were performed in North America for this evidence base, in particular the United States. We did capture studies from Oceania as well as Europe. There were some clear gaps in geographical coverage for studies in Northern Africa and parts of Western, Central, and South Asia. Should be noted, though, it's unclear whether the gaps in Asia are really true knowledge gaps or whether they're due to a language bias, since we only included English language full text in this map. So because of the broad scope of this review, we did not do a full formal study validity assessment, but we did extract key variables related to study methodology. And I just want to quickly highlight one of those. So many studies lack true comparators in this evidence base, meaning that many studies did not use a temporal or a spatial comparator, so before data from the same water body, for example, or a control site in a different but similar water body that didn't experience the intervention. And this is important because without an appropriate comparator, it's really unclear whether any observed change in an outcome can be attributed to the intervention itself. So it's just something to keep in mind with this evidence base. There were a variety of causes of change in or modification to flow captured in the map. So most study causes were related to natural causes. So again, these are floods and droughts, climate change. But we also captured a number of studies looking at changes in flow regime due to hydroelectric facilities as well as dams with no hydro. And in terms of the actual change in a component of flow regime, most studies focused on evaluating changes in magnitude, both across and within these causes. In terms of the actual synthesis, one of the great visual tools that we use for systematic maps are heat maps. So for those who may not be familiar with how to read a heat map, they're really a great way to visually see the distribution and frequency of the evidence base to help identify those knowledge clusters and gaps that we talked about earlier. And so what we're doing here is we're plotting the number of studies for a given outcome in relation to a linkage with a particular flow regime change. So again, changes could be duration, frequency, magnitude, and I've grouped these changes due to the cause of that change. And it develops a matrix of counts essentially, where there's darker colored cells will indicate a higher occurrence, higher frequency of occurrence of evidence, and the lighter colors will indicate a lower occurrence of evidence. It should be noted though that these are just plotting the number of studies for a particular linkage. It doesn't provide an indication of the strength of the direction of the impacts between that linkage. Okay, so in terms of knowledge clusters, this mapping exercise, we identified 11 subtopics that may warrant future evidence syntheses, including, for example, addressing a question such as how do changes in flow magnitude due to dams with no hydroelectric facilities affect the fish abundance? There's also a number of clusters related to asking how do changes in flow magnitude due to hydroelectric dams affect fish outcomes, such as abundance, diversity and richness, migration metrics, as well as some growth metrics. There's also some clusters related to how do natural changes in flow magnitude affect fish outcomes, such as abundance, diversity and richness, structure, recruitment, as well as growth metrics. In terms of gaps, we identified 6 understudied subtopics that may correspond to knowledge gaps that could potentially benefit from primary research. So first of all, in terms of causes, how are outcomes affected by changes in flow regime due to restoration, land use change, water withdrawal, and diversion activities? How are outcomes affected by changes to components of flow regime other than magnitude? So looking at changes in flow duration or frequency, for example. And lastly, in terms of actual fish outcomes, how do changes in flow magnitude affect fish survival, performance, reproduction, and population viability? Okay, in terms of implications, the outputs from this systematic map, so the map database itself, which is all the included sources of information, as well as all the extracted information, and the heat maps provide an up-to-date global picture of the available evidence on the measured effects between flow regime changes and fish productivity. Water resource and fish habitat managers may find the map useful to, first of all, decide whether to extract relevant information on time-sensitive issues that need answers quickly or species-specific questions. Secondly, they may find it helpful to identify areas where there may be sufficient coverage on specific policy-relevant questions to permit full systematic reviewing. So again, we identified 11 knowledge clusters, and I'm happy to say that 2 of these clusters have already been commissioned by DFO to undertake full systematic reviewing, and those are underway right now. And lastly, the map managers may find this map useful to decide or justify how to allocate future research funding. So again, we identified 6 knowledge gaps with this mapping exercise. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tarina. That was great. I was really glad that the audio worked fine for you. I don't see any questions at this time. So give it another couple seconds, and meanwhile, if anything pops up, I'll ask it. But I will introduce the next speaker then. Thank you very much, Tarina. That was great. So our next speaker is Lisa Kelly. Lisa is a PhD candidate at Carleton University in the Fish Ecology and Conservation Physiology Lab. So Lisa will be speaking to us today on can conservation targets for imperiled freshwater fishes and mussels be achieved by captive breeding and release programs?
Great,
No
thanks,
questions
Karen.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Lisa, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So hi everybody, thanks for coming. Oh, hold on. Yeah, so my name is Lisa and I'll be presenting the results of our recently completed systematic map entitled Existing Evidence on the Effectiveness of Conservation-Driven Captive Breeding and Release Programs for Imperiled Freshwater Fishes and Mussels. So just for some context, threats to freshwater fishes and mussels are widespread. There are captive breeding programs are used as one of the many tools by conservation practitioners, and there are programs that exist around the globe, but the availability of the evidence exploring the effectiveness of these programs has yet to be explored. So therefore, the question we asked in this systematic map was, what evidence exists on the effectiveness of captive breeding and release programs for imperiled freshwater fishes and mussels in temperate regions? I won't go into details on the methods and screening process, as Trina just covered the general processes in her talk, but I will explain the pertinent inclusion criteria so the results will make more sense. So here is a table of the study components and inclusion criteria. In the interest of time, I will just quickly highlight the intervention and exposure components. So here the inclusion criteria is that it is a conservation objective involving either propagation, supplementation, or reintroduction. We also included exploratory and genetic status objectives for studies that were relevant but were not necessarily associated with a specific captive breeding objective. Secondly, the stage of program included was categorized as either collection of broodstock, rearing and release methods, and monitoring of released individuals in the wild. So now I'll talk briefly about some of the descriptive statistics. So 460 articles were included following full text screening that resulted in 524 studies after data extraction. In fish, the majority of these studies were in the US, Canada, and Australia, whereas in mussels, the majority of these studies were in the US, the United Kingdom, and the Czech Republic. Looking at fish, when we look at the breakdown of captive breeding program objectives, we see that the majority of studies involve supplementation. While the stage of captive breeding comprised largely of monitoring in the wild, which comprised 50% of the studies, and rearing and release studies, which was around 42% of the studies. Looking at mussels, propagation and exploratory studies were the most common objectives. And when we look at the stage of captive breeding program, we can see that for all objectives captured, the rearing and release stages were the most common, and they comprised 81% of mussel studies. When looking at the types of study designs used to evaluate captive breeding programs for fish, we found that 58% of the included studies used a control in their design. And for mussels, it was only 25% of the studies included control in their design. Okay, so moving on now to the results of the outcomes measured. Most fish outcomes measured were related to genetic diversity, followed by growth metrics such as weight and length, and survival, such as the number survived or percent survival. In mussels, most of the outcomes measured were related to survival, followed by growth metrics. Okay, now on to the synthesis results. So the distribution and frequency of the evidence base was also compiled into structured heat maps showing linkages between the examined stages of a captive breeding program, grouped by the objective of the program, and fish and mussel outcomes. So these maps are then used to identify possible knowledge clusters, so subtopics that are sufficiently covered by existing studies to allow full systematic reviewing, and knowledge gaps, so subtopics that require further primary research. So in this matrix of counts, as Trina said, the darker colored cells will indicate higher frequency of occurrence of evidence, while lighter colors will show lower occurrences. In fish, we see a cluster of evidence for the effectiveness of supplementation during the rearing and release stage of captive breeding for growth, specifically mass and survival. We also see a cluster of evidence during the monitoring phase for genetic diversity metrics related to heterozygosity and allele frequency and richness, as well as for growth, again, mass and survival. We also see evidence clusters for the effectiveness of exploratory-driven rearing and release methods for fish recruitment, so reproduction and fecundity, and survival for age 0 fish, which we called reproductive survival. For identifying knowledge gaps, we see clear gaps in our ability to evaluate the effectiveness of any single captive breeding program objective, so propagation, reintroduction, or supplementation, across all 3 stages of a program. So that's the broodstock collection, the rearing and release methods, and post-release monitoring for all fish outcomes. We've also identified gaps for the effectiveness of broodstock collection for all objectives, and again, across all relevant outcomes. And we see gaps in the effectiveness of propagation and reintroduction focused captive breeding program objectives for all stages and across all relevant outcomes. And finally, we see gaps in the effectiveness of captive breeding programs, all objectives and all stages, on metrics related to fish abundance, behavior, and recruitment, with the exception of reproductive recruitment and the exploratory rearing and release methods. For mussels, we did not identify any knowledge clusters. And for knowledge gaps, we identify that overall, the available evidence base on the effectiveness of conservation-driven captive breeding and release programs for imperiled freshwater mussels is extremely limited. So to summarize, we were able to identify a number of interesting themes in the evidence base. First, most of the current evidence base on the effectiveness of captive breeding programs is coming from the US. Second, there is currently a limited evidence base for mussels, though it's not clear if this is a true knowledge gap or if studies are just not being documented or accessible. Thirdly, we found knowledge clusters for supplementation evaluations related to rearing and release methods for fish growth and survival, and monitoring for fish genetic diversity, growth, and survival metrics. We also found knowledge clusters for exploratory evaluation of fish recruitment and age 0 survival. And finally, as far as potential knowledge gaps, everything else essentially, but particularly for evaluations across all 3 stages of a captive breeding program. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. And I don't see any questions for Lisa either, so you could be off the hook. I actually have a question for you. Do you know if any of these areas of promise might be turned into a review, or if your map has led to DFO doing anything different in terms of improving the monitoring or evidence base in some of the areas that are deficient?
Well, we just finished this map this month, actually, so it's still pretty new. We'll be publishing the results shortly. But there, yeah, it does. I think there is some opportunity for kind of exploring those knowledge clusters a bit further, but I don't believe anything has come of that yet.
All right, yeah, it's still very new, so that would be a surprise if it did.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I guess we'll move on to our next speaker then. Our next speaker is Adrian Smith. Oh, wait, actually, I see a question. We can ask it quickly. Out of curiosity, okay, the mappings are really useful, very much appreciated. Out of curiosity, are there any methods for handling quality in these maps? For example, excluding obviously problematic studies, etc.
So for this map, we included, because we weren't taking like a full kind of meta-analysis from every article, it was just too broad, which is why it was changed from a review, systematic review, to a systematic map. So we did include qualitative and quantitative in these results, but yeah, if we wanted to be more specific in what our results are saying, I think we'd have to kind of be able to extract the data a little more concisely.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Adrienne is an environmental evidence synthesis technician at the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation at Carleton University. And she is going to be speaking to us today on do fish passage facilities and culverts promote fish movement at barriers, a systematic review. Adrienne.
Hello, everyone can hear me fine, I hope. So I'm Adrienne Smith. Today I will be speaking about our project relating to fish passage solutions. Unlike the projects Trina and Lisa just spoke on, this is a systematic review as opposed to a map. The primary difference being that the reviews, we extracted the results, assess some study validity, and conduct some form of meta-analysis. So given the widespread presence of barriers on fluvial systems, there is much demand by environmental managers and policymakers to define the effectiveness of fish passage solutions. So the primary question to be addressed in this study was to what extent do fish passage facilities and culverts provide up and downstream passage for fish? This review is currently in its final stages with analysis ongoing, and we've received some review comments so far. The final stages of synthesis that are currently being addressed relate to some of the secondary questions, including the influence of biotic and abiotic factors, the effectiveness for non-target species, and determination of best practices and recommendations. We used the PICO framework to define our evaluation. We included all fish attempting passage, any structure implemented to reduce barrier impacts, and all outcomes related to use, efficiency, and survival. An important note is related to comparators, was that the existing literature base generally doesn't include comparators. Therefore, we included all relevant studies in our analysis that meet our other criteria, and we will instead incorporate study validity into the discussion of our conclusions and recommendations. So searches, screening, and extraction were completed following CCE standards, which I won't detail here today, but generally the articles could be subdivided into 4 categories for synthesis. For the remaining of the presentation, I will focus the discussion on fish weight articles, which detail upstream passage structures and their efficiency. But it is important to note that the review also includes downstream guidance devices, upstream and downstream passage at culverts, and trap and transport programs. Upstream fishway structures were generally the most commonly studied intervention type across the globe, with the highest numbers of studies found in North America, followed by a range of European countries. So the gold standard for estimating passage efficiency or any efficiency is the use of electronic tagging technique, although other techniques are possible, including marker capture or fish counting devices. One difficulty encountered early in the process was defining the efficiencies used in upstream passage studies. For the purposes of this review, we defined several locations, the first being the release site downstream of the structure, followed by an approach zone, which was included if the released fish were detected or observed at least 3 meters away from the fishway entrance. This was because the next zone we defined was the attraction zone, which was defined as the number of fish detected or observed near enough to the fishway entrance for a fish to detect attraction flow, which based on literature review was within 3 meters. And to isolate entrance from attraction, the study needed to have a detection device or observation directly at the entrance of the fishway or inside the first quarter length of the fishway. And finally, passage required a detection or observation at the exit of the fishway or just on the upstream side. So based on authors' descriptions of the number of fish at these different locations and zones, 3 different efficiency types can be described. So the first here is attraction efficiencies. These are based on their proportion of fish moving from release or approach into the attraction zone, or from release into the approach zone. Secondly, we can look at entrance efficiencies, which describe the proportions of fish moving from release, approach, or attraction zones into the entrance zone. And finally, passage efficiencies, which is the proportion of fish moving from any zone to the exit of the fishway. And then practically demonstrated here is an example from a paper included in our database, which demonstrates the author's descriptions of these detection zones that we would include in the database. So here they describe a release, an attraction, entrance, and passage. In this example, the highlighted numbers are the number of fish detected in each zone, and therefore the possible efficiency metrics included in our database would be shown below. So shown here is a breakdown of the number of data sets that were considered eligible for quantitative synthesis. Reasons studies were not included in the quantitative synthesis were that they were a use-based study, where the authors only reported the number or presence of fish that used the fishway, or that there was missing data. For example, the article reported an efficiency metric, but not the raw values for calculation. Furthermore, you can see very few studies had comparators, as we expected, but all of these studies were included in the analysis regardless. And generally, the most common efficiency metric measured was passage-based, with passage D, which was the proportion of fish released that then exited, being the most commonly reported. Overall mean weighted upstream efficiency estimates were calculated for all attraction, entrance, and passage metrics combined, and demonstrated a wide range of results within each efficiency type. When looking at mean efficiency metrics within each efficiency type, we can see a lower mean efficiency when you consider metrics that were calculated using the total number of fish released. Also, when comparing metrics within efficiency types, i.e. between A, B, and C metrics within a type, we see more variation for entrance and passage efficiencies than we do for attraction efficiencies. To explain some of this variation seen within each metric, we have begun examining potential effect modifiers, including efficiency of different fishway types. So upstream fishway studies were categorized into 9 intervention designs. The most common fishway designs were pool and weir, followed by vertical slot, and then baffle designs. Demonstrated here is the association between fishway type and all of the passage metrics. As you can see, there's a wide range of results. I'll highlight a few. For example, if you consider passage A, which is fish moving from the attraction zone to the exit, the highest passage efficiency seen is in vertical slot design. Whereas if you look at passage D metric, which is the proportion of fish released that then passed, other baffle designs and gates had the highest estimates. We also examined the variation in efficiency metrics related to the study species. Salmonidae was the most common family studied in general, with almost 50% of the studies. Shown on the left are the most frequently reported genera in studies, and on the right are the results of the fish family associations with passage efficiency metric D. Salmonids, anguillids, and catastomids were some of the most commonly reported families and were associated with some of the highest estimated passage efficiencies compared to other families. Efficiency associations with fishway type and species are the first among a list of other sources of variation we hope to examine. Others to be included relate to the effects of study setting, dimensions of the fishways themselves, whether the species was the target for the fishway design, among others. Depending on sample sizes, we can explore these specific fishway types within specific fishway types or all fishway types combined. We will use these results to explore the implication of policy development and make recommendations for future fish passage studies. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. I don't see any questions at this time, but I'm pretty excited to see some of the results from the analysis that you've been doing. So the metric you're using is just percent efficiency. And is there any, this is probably not really part of the review, but I'm just wondering, is there any actual threshold by which people declare the fish weigh a success or not? Like, does it have to reach at least 50%? Because not that many seem to be above 50%.
Yeah, there didn't seem to be, like, in reading the papers, much consensus on like a threshold that then now you would consider this fish weigh a success. So that could be something that out of this you might see the highest values are 50%. So maybe that's the goal you're looking for, and anything above that is sort of uniquely efficient. But specifically in the literature, there hasn't been much discussion about where that threshold is currently.
That would be interesting to see if we could come up with something like that from this review. So just a note to Jessica, there are a couple of comments in the question box about audio, so I'm not sure what to do about that, but hopefully not too many people have lost audio. All right, well, we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dirk Algira. He's a PhD candidate in Dr. Steve Cook's lab at Carleton University in Ottawa, and he's being co-supervised by Dr. Michael Power at University of Waterloo. He is a student member of the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation, and he's going to be presenting part of his doctoral thesis today on what are the relative risks of mortality and injury for fish during downstream passage at hydroelectric dams in temperate regions, a systematic review. Dirk.
Thanks for that introduction, Karen. And so I'm Dirk, and I will be presenting us some results of a completed systematic review on the relative risks of fish mortality and injury during downstream passage at hydropower facilities. Doesn't seem to be. So Trina's covered the systematic review process, so I won't go over that again and focus on presenting some of the key results. I just wanted to point out that the protocol and final systematic review here are published in the open access journal Environmental Evidence, so please consult those for a full representation of the methodology and results. So the primary question for this review was what are the consequences of fish entrainment and impingement associated with hydroelectric dams on freshwater fish in temperate regions? And stemming from that, we also wanted to ask to what extent do factors such as site type, intervention type, et cetera, influence injury and mortality from entrainment and impingement? We used a PICO framework to address these questions and develop our inclusion criteria. And the population here was temperate regions, and you can see those depicted in the highlighted in pink in the globe figure here, and freshwater fish. The intervention types were the various hydropower infrastructure. You can see some of these or many of these depicted in the dam figure below, so juvenile bypass systems or spillways. Comparators in this review were no intervention or a modification of the intervention, and here was typically a downstream release of fish immediately downstream of a particular infrastructure type. And the outcomes here were fish injuries such as bruising or scale loss, and immediate mortality, which was measured at less than 1 hour, and delayed mortality, which was greater than or equal to 1 hour. So this flow chart here is all really to say that we started off with 3,121 records for screening purposes, and after the screening resulted in 87 articles and 264 studies that met the inclusion criteria. and for the narrative synthesis. So getting into some descriptive statistics of the evidence base for the narrative synthesis, accounting for 60 of the 87 articles, most of the literature base, or the evidence base rather, was gray literature, so government and consulting reports, that kind of thing. And the remaining was commercially published in various journals. You can also see that there was a fairly wide range of years for which these articles were published. And there was some more descriptive statistics. There was a strong taxonomic bias in the evidence base, with the majority of studies conducted on salmonids, particularly the Pacific salmonids. And there was also a study location bias, such that the vast majority of the studies were conducted in the United States, with a handful of them elsewhere. And moving into the quantitative synthesis. So once again, this flowchart just kind of shows that of the 87 articles and 264 studies in the narrative synthesis, that was pared down to 75 articles, 222 studies, and 522 data sets that were included to drive the quantitative synthesis. And for this synthesis, quantitative synthesis, we used a relative risk ratio for the effect size metric in the meta-analysis. And in this review, the relative risk ratio provides a measure of the strength of the association between an exposure, so here, fish exposed to infrastructure associated with hydropower facilities, and an outcome, and here that would be fish injury and or mortality. We also included the absolute risk difference, which is a useful metric for fisheries managers and hydropower operators. And the absolute risk difference provides the actual difference in observed risk of events between the intervention and control groups. So for the next few slides, the key take-home messages for management implications will be highlighted in a red box, and the relative risk estimates accounting for the control group are presented as a percentage, and the corresponding risk difference will be indicated in the parentheses. So to address the primary question, taken together, basically, our results suggest that overall, hydropower infrastructure increased the overall risk of freshwater fish injury and immediate mortality in temperate regions. And these results were consistent regardless of the effect size metric used. And getting into the secondary questions, so the effects modifiers, you'll see for the next few slides this same or similar figure. So I'm just going to go over it briefly. On the x-axis is the mean effect size, and the y-axis will be the various effects modifiers. The dotted line indicates the line of no effect. So for risk ratio or relative risk ratio, it's set at 1, and an estimated mean effect size to the right of the dotted line indicates an overall increase in risk of fish injury or mortality relative to the control, and to the left indicates a decrease. And red text indicates a statistically significant increase, in green a decrease. So injury risk varied among the various infrastructure types, with spillways and turbines associated with higher risk ratios relative to controls than general infrastructure and bypasses. And just to clarify, general infrastructure is when more than one component was measured, and thus the effect size, we couldn't tie it to a single infrastructure component. And there was actually a decrease for the bypasses, as you can see there. Immediate mortality risk also varied amongst the infrastructure types, with general infrastructure, turbines, and sluiceways associated with higher risk ratios than spillways and water bypasses, and this was a stronger effect in the general infrastructure and the turbines. And within field-based studies, Francis turbines had higher immediate mortality risk relative to controls compared to Kaplan turbines. And we were able to conduct a taxonomic analysis, and that revealed that a significant increased injury and immediate mortality risk relative to controls for river herring and Pacific salmonids, and an increased delayed mortality risk for freshwater eels. So to address limitations of the evidence base, there are some implications for research, including addressing gaps for systems outside of North America and on non-salmonids or non-sportfish target species. And we were originally intending to look at population level consequences, but this was not feasible given that most of the articles did not scale up to the population level. And with that, I will take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. We do have a couple of questions here for you. So the first one is, for the gray literature, were they accessed online, as in only accessible online were used, or did you get physical hard copy reports as well?
There was a mixture, so many of them were available freely online, especially from government, if it was through a government program that they were assessing the injury and mortality or entrainment, but some we did have to put in to receive from specifically from the consulting firms, or not consulting firms, but they weren't published online. We did have to put in requests through our library services to get those documents and actually physically scan them for inclusion.
Okay. And another question is, how do you deal with the focus on salmonids in the literature base?
Well, it's just a caveat of the review, I suppose. It just would caution against then extrapolating onto other species, given that information. But that's what the evidence basis is largely comprised of. So that's what we had to work with.
Yeah, salmonids are important to everyone.
Certainly.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dirk. We'll move on to our next speaker, is Dr. Stephen Alexander. Steve is a science advisor with the Environment and Biodiversity Science branch of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and he works out of Ottawa. Now, unfortunately today, Steve was not able to be here, but he pre-recorded his seminar, and so we'll be listening to that. So in light of that, and the fact that he's not here to actually answer any questions, please do send in questions to us, and we will be recording them, and we will make sure Steve gets them and can reply directly to the asker upon his return. So without further ado, Jessica is going to play Steve's presentation. And he will be speaking on bridging Indigenous and science-based knowledge in aquatic research, monitoring and management in Canada. Jessica, I don't hear it playing.
Okay, that was probably because I was muted. Hold on.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for this opportunity to share a bit about the work that I've been involved in here at Fisheries.
Is that there, Karen?
Yeah, that's good, thanks.
Canada, related to bridging Indigenous and science-based knowledge in aquatic research, monitoring, and management. My name is Steve Alexander. I'm a science advisor within the ecosystem and ocean sciences sector. I'd like to begin, though, by acknowledging that I'm a guest on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And for that, I'm grateful. Now, today's talk has 4 components to it. I'll start with a brief introduction, giving some background and context to this work and initiative to help us better understand how this fits within this broader context of drawing on evidence-based approaches to inform work within federal science departments. From there, I'm going to go a bit more specific, talking about the Bridging Indigenous and Science-Based Knowledge Initiative. Then third, I'm going to highlight some emerging insights from Canada's coasts, some of the first work we've done in this realm. And I will finish by touching upon some of the next steps. Where are we going with this work? Now, in the Canadian context, an increased focus on environmental research, monitoring, and management practices that are inclusive of Indigenous knowledge systems is driven by a number of interrelated factors, including 1, federal legal requirements and international commitments to include Indigenous knowledge in environmental conservation, 2, ethical considerations and responsibilities, and 3, increased research capacity and self-determination among Indigenous communities, specifically First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities across modern-day Canada. As perhaps one example of this commitment and resurgence is from this quote from Dr. Norman Niemer, Chief Science Advisor, which came from her letter to the Prime Minister after her first 100 days in office. However, successfully drawing upon multiple types of knowledge in environmental research and management remains a challenge. In response, there's been an emerging need for examples and strategies for bridging Indigenous and science-based knowledge. So research scientists and staff, colleagues are asking, well, when has this happened? Where has it happened? Who's been involved? What does it look like? And perhaps most importantly, how does it happen? How does this work happen? How do we bridge these different ways of knowing? Now, when I speak of bridging knowledge systems, I'm referring to a process that maintains the integrity of each respective knowledge system while enabling the reciprocal exchange of understanding for mutual learning. This is similar to what Heather Castleton and her colleagues referred to as integrative approaches, which they were trying to capture the dynamic and co-evolving process of knowledge co-production associated with the intersection of Indigenous and science-based knowledge systems. Now, the great news is that we have a wealth of examples. There has been a proliferation of place-based case studies that bring together different knowledge systems, shedding light on diverse species, habitats, and ecosystems globally. Moreover, there is much that could be learned from these case studies with regards to methods and approaches to inform practice. Yet the challenge is that these examples are scattered throughout the literature. Staff, scientists, collaborators are left having to navigate this expansive labyrinth in the literature. So that brings me to the Bridging Indigenous and Science-Based Knowledge Initiative. The main objective of this initiative is to identify practices, processes, and principles for bridging Indigenous and science-based knowledge in research and monitoring to inform our own internal practices for collaborative research and monitoring work. We can think about this in kind of a number of different aspects and a number of different questions of what we're looking to ask. The starting point for all of this is to identify cases where knowledge bridging has happened. From there, we can then ask a number of other questions. Well, how has that knowledge bridging happened? What are the particular processes or methods that have been used? What are the outcomes from bridging knowledge? And finally, we can seek to identify exemplary cases of knowledge bridging, that is, bright spots, as well as identify context-dependent practices and principles. Now, today and now, where are we in this initiative, is here in this first step. That's identifying cases where knowledge bridging has happened. Now, within this work, identifying cases. And there's a few aspects to this. We started with conducting a coastal marine systematic map. We identified 71 published case studies across Canada's 3 coasts. From there, and where we are right now, we're just wrapping up a second systematic map to identify freshwater case studies across Canada. Here we identified an additional 74 published cases. And right now we've just initiated with collaborators over Environment and Climate Change Canada to start identifying published case studies in the terrestrial realm. So this is currently in progress. Today, I'm going to speak about some of the work that emerged from this very first systematic map focused on coastal marine contexts across Canada's 3 coasts. So this initial systematic map was a partnership between DFO and the Center for Evidence-Based Conservation and Environmental Management, as well as with collaborators at Environment and Climate Change Canada and University of Kansas. Our objective of this map was to examine the extent, range, and nature of published case studies that respectfully integrate or include Indigenous and science-based knowledge in ecological research, monitoring, or natural resource management across Canada's 3 coasts. I want to highlight some of the trends, patterns, and insights that emerged from this. So as you will recall, in this first systematic map, we identified 71 published studies that were included in the database and our narrative synthesis. And you can see the distribution of those in the map on the right of your screen. I'm going to talk about some critical gaps, a few of the knowledge clusters that emerged, and about the diversity of methods and approaches that we started to glean from this initial work. Now, 2 particular gaps identified include the lack of relevant published studies found along the Atlantic coast. You can see the sparseness there, as especially compared to the significant number found along the Arctic coast or across what is referred to as Inuit Unangat, the homelands of the Inuit. And the second gap we identified was the complete absence of studies that included Métis traditional knowledge. Now, I want to talk about a few of the knowledge clusters that we identified from this. So here what we did is we create a structured matrix where we have studies, case studies based on jurisdiction there on the left, about provincial, territorial, and modern land claim agreement, and then looked at the focal species of the studies. We had 20 different species. We list them here at the level of genus. And you can see from the structured maintenance or structured matrix or heat map, a few clusters there. The first is related to Pacific salmon, the second related to narwhal, and the third or fourth related to beluga and herring. So these present potential areas where we can dive deeper, as there's multiple case studies related to each of these species that we could potentially learn from around collaboration and around the methods and practices for bridging different ways of knowing. Now, finally, I want to talk a little bit about some of the diversity of methods and methodologies. Here we can see the relationship between the coastal marine region, focus of study, ecological scale, and methodology. Now, despite the diversity of methodologies employed, this work draws attention to the significantly uneven distribution across methodologies. So when it comes time to dive into the question of how, we call the second major part of the initiative, there's a plethora of examples for some methodologies like case study, while for others like ethnography or simulation, there are very few published examples that can be drawn on. Now, the other way we can look at this is where we find kind of the intersection of methods used for collating and illustrating and drawing out Indigenous knowledge and those used related to scientific data collection methods. Now, mapping and distinguishing between methods associated with Indigenous knowledge and those employed for science data collection drew attention to some limitations to the approach we've taken here. So first off, there are examples where a particular scientific method, say tissue sampling or numerical counts of individual species, required and or relied upon Indigenous knowledge holders, such as active or retired hunters, but that may have not been articulated or presented as such in the study, depending on the kinds of information that are put forward and shared in standard scientific publications. And furthermore, the coupling of methods varied across the cases and is not revealed at this resolution. For example, in some instances, there was one singular method employed with regards to Indigenous knowledge and one singular method employed with regards to the collection of science data. In other instances, there were multiple methods employed on both sides. Finally, we want to recognize the specific place-based needs of communities. We draw attention to the importance that one use this information in context and note that what worked well in one community may not work in another. However, by doing these broad examinations of case studies, we can consider options for successful paths and pathways that include Indigenous knowledge and science. So where to from here? A few of the next steps. The first is expanding the collection of case studies, and I highlighted that already at the beginning. We're now identified published studies across the freshwater context, and now we're also looking to identify published studies in the terrestrial realm, what we can learn collectively from these. As we pull together this collection of case studies, there's then additional analysis and evaluation of the case studies that can be undertaken to inform our practices. We can ask questions around how knowledge bridging has happened, more specifics around the practices and processes. We can ask questions about the outcomes from knowledge bridging. What do we see, and are there different outcomes that occur because of this? And finally, identifying examples, exemplary cases of knowledge bridging that we can use to inform practice and to help our staff and scientists improve the methods and approaches that they take. With that, I say thank you, merci beaucoup, miigwech.
Okay, well, thanks, Steve, in his absence for his recording. And if anyone has questions, please send them to us and we will make sure that they are answered. So without further ado, I'll introduce our next speaker. It's Dr. Michael Jones. Mike is an emeritus professor of fisheries and wildlife at Michigan State University, where he co-directs the Quantitative Fisheries Center. Mike will be speaking to us on structured decision-making, a complementary tool to evidence synthesis for guiding good environmental decisions. Because of a sketchy potential connection, Mike recorded his talk for us, but he is participating and will be able to answer questions live at the end. So go ahead, Jessica.
Good morning. So back in January of this year, Steve Cook came to Good morning. So back in January of this year, Steve Cook came to Michigan State University for a visit, and he gave a seminar on evidence synthesis, work that he'd been doing in evidence synthesis, and actually talked about the conference that we were supposed to be going to in June. And as I listened to that talk, I was really struck by the strong connection between what he was talking about and something I've spent a lot of time doing over the years, and that's structured decision making. So my presentation today is going to tell you a little bit about structured decision making, and then make a case for how evidence synthesis seems like a very strong complement to the methods of structured decision making. So what do we mean by a decision? Well, a decision obviously is the act of choosing among a set of alternatives. A decision is sort of the next step after you've indicated a preference, where you're actually deciding what to do based on that preference. And decisions often involve an irrevocable allocation of resources, which is why decisions are important, because sometimes it's difficult to go back once you've made a decision. So a very famous behavioral economist named Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his work, once said that the human mind is a machine for jumping to conclusions, by which he meant that we're not very good at making decisions. He argued that typically decisions are made based on alternatives rather than objectives, as I'll talk about in a minute. That decisions are often made in too much of a hurry, that they involve an implicit evaluation of trade-offs that are really important to think about, and that they often rely on rules of thumb, and as a consequence of all these things, they often tend not to be the best decision made. Why is it difficult to make decisions? Well, there are several reasons, but some ones to highlight are, first off, that the objectives that should inform decisions are often complex and contradictory based on the varying perspectives of different groups or individuals who have interest in the problem and have disagreements on the values that are important to them. Another reason is that we often aren't aware of all of the possible actions or alternatives that we could take when we're considering a decision. The system dynamics are often poorly known. In other words, there's a lot of uncertainty about the consequences of our decisions, and that's what I'm going to really be focusing on here. And then lastly, the trade-offs that I alluded to in the previous slide are very difficult to make in many cases because they involve conflicting values. So how can we improve decision making? Well, probably the most important thing is to effectively incorporate stakeholder values into the process of making decisions. I'm not going to talk about that anymore here. It's important to try to incorporate uncertainty in a thoughtful and objective way into decisions, and it's really useful to take complex problems and decompose them into their component parts so that you can understand how the actions that you might consider taking are going to affect things that you care about. So structured decision making is essentially a process that it is intended to try to address those limitations using what we refer to as a values-based, transparent, and objective decision-making process. And values-based is the key here. The idea is that the decisions are focused on figuring out what it is that you value and then selecting the alternatives that are most likely to maximize those values for you. If you want to read more about decision making, the book that's highlighted on the right there is an excellent introduction to the process. And it talks about a thing called PROACT, an acronym that refers to the 5 key steps of a good structured decision making process: problem, objectives, alternatives, consequences, and trade-offs. So let's have a quick look at what those 5 components are. The first step, problem, is basically the important step of making sure that you're working on the right problem, thinking about the scope and scale and who should be involved in thinking about the decision, all of those sort of contextual things. Second step is to think very carefully about what the desired outcomes are for those who are interested in the decision, defining objectives. Third step is to then think creatively about any reasonable alternatives that you might want to consider that could achieve the outcomes you're looking for. Fourth step, consequences, is where you get down and think about how well those alternatives you're considering might meet your objectives. And then the final step is the trade-off step, where you're evaluating how the outcomes that might result from different alternatives weigh against the objectives, and especially against competing objectives. So the key step for our discussion here is the consequences step, the step where you're thinking about how well alternatives might meet your objectives. So how do we go about examining consequences in structured decision making? Well, a picture here will sort of help us sort of frame that. Imagine that we have a set of objectives. Here we have 3, and we have 2 alternatives that we're interested in choosing between. So the question is going to be, what are the consequences of taking alternative A and the consequences of taking alternative B? And how will those consequences serve to meet our 3 objectives? And the process of doing this relies on a method of analysis that can simply be called forecasting. Forecasting the consequences of different alternatives. So how do we go about forecasting consequences? Well, there are a variety of methods that you can use. The most obvious and common one is to construct models that allow you to predict or forecast the future. But you can also rely on literature searches. You could rely on scientific experiments that inform you about consequences in a trial sort of basis. You can collect field data to inform you about what the consequences might be. Oftentimes we rely on the knowledge of experts to help us to judge what consequences will be. And importantly, in a lot of situations, there is both local and indigenous knowledge that can be brought to bear on thinking about consequences. The bottom line on all of this is that all of these things are essentially the process of synthesizing the evidence synthesis. And that's what why I think that there's such a strong connection between structured decision-making and evidence synthesis, because this key step in structured decision-making is about evidence synthesis. Now, it turns out that analyzing consequences in structured decision-making is pretty difficult. It is arguably the most technically challenging part of the structured decision-making process, because it's where you really kind of probing what your understanding is of how the world works. There's lots of uncertainty for any complex decision that you're trying to make. And there really aren't standard procedures for doing consequence analysis. It sort of relies on the talents and skills of the investigator, the decision analyst. And so these procedures often lack rigor. And they leave you in a situation where it's often difficult as you're analyzing and summarizing consequences to separate strong evidence from weak evidence. So these strike me as exactly the kinds of things that evidence synthesis is designed to try to add rigor to and be more systematic about. So it seems obvious to me that this is a great place for evidence synthesis to contribute to good decision making. Okay, so I'll leave you with a slide that just lists some places where we have applied structured decision making in the Great Lakes, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was great. I don't see any questions, and we are a little bit behind now. So if anyone has questions, please send them along to us, and we'll make sure that we get them to Mike and they get answered. So we're going to move along to Dr. Andrew Pullen. Andrew is the Chief Executive Officer of the Collaborator of Environmental Evidence. He's the editor-in-chief of the CEE journal. Sorry, of course, now my phone is ringing. And he's based at Bangor University in the UK. Andrew will be speaking about CEDAR, an evidence service to inform decision-making in the environmental sector. And I will now mute. Andrew, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Delighted to be here today for this CEE webinar. Yeah, I want to talk to you about a new evidence service which CEE has developed over the last couple of years, which we call CEDAR. It's basically means CEE's database of evidence reviews, and the service is really for decision makers, any decision makers in the environmental sector. Whilst traditionally CEE has concentrated, of course, on the idea of doing systematic reviews, systematic maps, as we've seen today. There are many other reviews out there, and they're being published at a rate of hundreds per year. And we thought it would be useful to the environmental management community, the environmental sector as a whole, if we gathered all of these together so that they could be easily found for those who want to use these reviews or evidence syntheses for their decision making. But we also thought it was very important, of course, to be able to look at these reviews critically and to see to what extent they are reliable sources of evidence. So in terms of what is CEDAR, it's a database of evidence reviews, and really all of these reviews we collect claim to measure effectiveness of an intervention or impact of an exposure in some way. We do plan to broaden this out a little bit in the future, but really it's quite precise at the moment. Its coverage is global, and anything in the environmental sector is included, but we do at the moment concentrate on natural sciences rather than the social sciences, although again that may be included in the future. We attempt to collate all the available reviews, mostly the commercially published ones, of course, but as best as we can, we want to include grey reviews as well. they're more difficult to find, of course. The database, alongside providing a list of all of these reviews, provides a breakdown of the reliability of each reviews as measured by our synthesis appraisal tool, CSAT. And so this looks at a number of aspects of the conduct and reporting of the review, and rates and assesses these reviews in respect of two aspects of reliability. One is the risk of bias caused by the conduct of the review, and the other is the risk of bias set by the primary data itself, because some reviews can be seriously limited, of course, by the fact that they find very little data from the primary literature. And beside actually gathering together these reviews so that they can be used by the evidence community, we're also trying to support and incentivize authors to improve review methodology and replicability, so that in the future this database will contain many more reliable reviews than less reliable ones. This was really inspired by a piece of work that we did some time ago when we looked at reviews published during 2015. We took a sample of reviews and we used our first CSAT tool to look at the reliability of these reviews, and found that a very large majority of them scored very low in terms of their reliability. All sorts of aspects of the reviews were not conducted or not reported particularly well. All of those aspects that you saw in some of the previous talks that were steps in systematic review, such as screening, searching, screening, eligibility criteria, data extraction, data synthesis methods, all of those things were scoring relatively low. And so we thought, if we wanted to include all of these reviews, we would have to provide some view of reliability. How is the CEDAR database produced? Well, we have an editorial team which searches and screens and compiles the database, and then we use a review college, a larger number of people who've been trained to use the CSAT tool, to essentially assess each review. And each review gets at least 2 independent reviewers, and then is also looked at for differences in those assessments, so that we can end up with one overall score for a review. And then we have an advisory board. We're building up an advisory board of service users to help us develop the database, and I'll come back to that at the end. You can access CEDAR via the CE website. It's open source, it's open access, it's free to use. You have search functions to find your relevant reviews, and then display functions so that you can compare reviews and look at the assessments and look at their reliability. And there's also online training, both for users of the system and for authors and editors, with advice on how to improve their reviews in the future. So if you go into the CEDAR database, you'll and look for search the CEDAR database on the menu on the left-hand side. You'll be able to see a total number of reviews in the database, the years that it covers, and then there's a search facility below where you can search by title and abstract and keyword, or by the review question that the review claims to address. And if you do this, put in a number of keywords, you'll probably get a list of reviews that on the left-hand side, you'll see the review question. That's not the title of the review, it's the question that we think that the review is actually trying to address. And then a whole range of issues of criteria, 1.1 to 7.4, which are the CSAT criteria, and a number of little icons which tend to show you know, how reliable each review was in regard to those criteria. And we have a 4-point scale at the moment, which Starts with gold. You can see a few gold stars there, and then to green, then to amber, and then down to red for aspects which we think are particularly unreliable. And you'll see for this particular sample that most of the reviews have problems with unreliable aspects. And you can dig into, you can drill into this if you want to and see exactly which criteria are marked as green and which are red, and how that explains how they're at risk of bias or limited due to data availability. Then if you pick a particular review, you can just click on the green icon on the left-hand side and you can get the full title of the review, the authors, the date and the abstract, and a link to the full text. We can't obviously guarantee that you can get to the full text because they may be behind paywalls, but it at least gives you a link to it so that you can see if you can find it and get access to it or not. So you can obviously select those reviews which are most relevant to you and most reliable for you, but also you can look at, you know, if you really want to, you can look at reasons why particular reviews are not so reliable. And on other areas of the site will give you an idea of how to use the CEDAR to its full potential, and also the process of how we go about identifying the reviews and how we go about appraising the reviews if you're interested. And lastly, this is under development. We have only just started this process and we're constantly improving it, we hope. And the most important aspect of that is that we're trying to co-produce this service with the actual users from organizations, government organizations and non-governmental organizations that may be potentially using this evidence service. And so if you are from any of those organizations that think you'll be interested in it, it will be great to hear from you. We have various ways of you getting engaged in the CEDAR production, and you can really pick and choose how you might like to do that, including becoming a member of the Review College or contributing to the editorial process. And so, yeah, take that opportunity if you'd really like to know more about CEDAR and get involved. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew. We're a little tight on time, but I think I'll squeeze in a couple questions anyway. So is a database of evidence review, does it allow to assess the impacts of not having an intervention?
Yes, if reviews are comparing having an intervention versus not having an intervention, then they would be in the database.
All right, that seems like a great tool for sure. So is the goal to work back in time to include synthesis from before 2018, or to just work forward by including newly published syntheses?
Okay, yes. So we took the decision to go from 2018. We didn't have the resources to go backwards, and we don't think that will be a particularly good use of our resources anyway, because of course evidence reviews will go out of date fairly quickly, and so we think, you know, it won't be very long before 2018 evidence reviews will seem a little out of date. So that's a unique thing with reviews, really, as opposed to primary data. They do become less and less reliable over time.
Okay, thank you again, Andrew. That looks like
Okay.
a really useful tool, and I'm sure I'll be looking into it at some point myself. So now I guess I'm going to introduce myself. I'm a research scientist with the Great Lakes Laboratory for Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences in DFO. And I'm in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And today I am going to be speaking about the transfer of scientific evidence to policy and regulatory decision makers. Let me just get this going here. There, okay. A critical translation step in support of evidence-based decisions. So the Canadian government has made a commitment to use evidence in decision making, but the different departments are approaching this challenge in a variety of ways. I apologize, I'm having technical difficulties with my screen. So this figure demonstrates 5 critical steps for applied environmental research to ultimately achieve a success, which is actually the uptake of the knowledge that's generated from all of our research. And researchers really do typically excel at tiers 1 and 2, which is generating the knowledge base, but the so-called knowledge action gap in the middle is where we as scientists can often fall flat. So how do we do a better job at that to make sure that we get success as in terms of uptake of our research? So in Fisheries and Oceans Canada, we choose to use something called the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat, or CSAS for short. And this is a body of DFO that organizes advisory processes across a range of scales from regional to national, and there are different process types. The approach is based on the SAGE guidelines, which are the scientific advice for government effectiveness. And these include early issue identification. It ensures inclusiveness on various expertise and perspectives, that the advice is based on sound science that's rigorous and professional, that we assess and communicate uncertainty and risk, that the processes, at least the outcomes, are transparent and open. All of the documents are published on the CSAS website and publicly available, and how the science was taken into account is explained. And periodic reviews are done when necessary to update based on new knowledge. So a little bit of history of CSAS. It started in the early 90s, which is almost solely at that time as a fish stock status report reviews for stock assessments and quota setting. But after the SAGE principles were published in 2000, other sectors started to take an interest, and the ecosystem and habitat status reports started to be published. But since 2004, there really has been quite an explosion of CSAS processes in support of a wide range of client sectors, including fisheries, fish and fish habitat protection branch, aquatic invasive species, and species at risk, all of which have regulatory requirements through DFO. So a CSAS process includes research documents that provide the information to support the process. And then after the meeting is held or the process is conducted, there is a consensus-based science advisory report produced and published. And some of the examples from various sectors I've just highlighted here. But about 50 to 60 science advisory reports are now produced annually and are published on the CSAS website. The research documents, though, are critical supporting information for the process. And they include data summaries, stock status reports, risk assessment, or literature reviews relevant to the topic at hand. But the literature reviews have typically and more historically been based on traditional methods that have their inherent potential issues. But with the increased number of systematic literatures being commissioned by the government, we decided to use one as the basis for a CSAS process to turn the results into advice. So this particular process was held in January of 2019, and it was co-chaired again by myself and Amanda Weingartner. And 2 of the 3 research documents that supported the work were out of the Cook Lab. So the systematic review, the effectiveness of spawning habitat creation or enhancement for substrate spawning temperate fish. And then, because that was conducted under the rigorous CEE guidelines for acceptance of quality of the science included, we actually asked Trina et al. To take the lower quality studies and do a comparative analysis and synthesis of those results to include low, medium, and high quality studies. And we published that as a technical report in Fisheries and Oceans, which is also publicly available. So we held the process and we produced the science advisory report from that. There were 12 summary bullets included at the beginning of the SAR. I'm only going to highlight a few of them here, but the bottom line was that manipulating spawning habitat actually does appear to improve the outcomes for fish. That there were, again, as we've seen in a number of the talks today, few groups of fish and intervention types that had enough evidence to reach quantitative conclusions. So the knowledge base is not necessarily as strong as it could be. But we also recognize there were thousands of spawning habitat manipulations that weren't even assessed as part of this review, because they're either not assessed at all or not assessed appropriately, or we just couldn't actually access the data. The magnitude of benefits between the two reviews, the one published in CEE and the tech report, actually differed. And it seemed that we got better outcomes from the actual higher quality studies included in the CEE review. And in the tech report, there's a detailed table comparing those two outcomes. Because so many of the studies were actually excluded, we took time during the process to produce minimum evaluation criteria for monitoring programs in the hopes that they actually started to improve future research and monitoring that's conducted as part of an authorization within DFO. So by proponents, etc. And at the same time, also wanting to establish a standardized data collection, reporting, management, and accessibility of those data so that we can actually include the results from these monitoring programs in future systematic reviews. But sometimes quantitative results, or even the advice and the science advisory report, is not necessarily of direct use to management. Sometimes it's unclear how they should actually apply the advice, particularly if the advice presents multiple options or specific steps to operationalize that advice are not spelt out. The uptake can still be uncertain and low. And this is just a snippet of the comparative table that shows the different results that you can get depending on the level of quality of results that you include. And even this can lead to some confusion in terms of how to apply the advice. So the utility of systematic reviews in the CSAS process has advantages, challenges, and there is a lot of potential. Of course, the advantages are, as we all know, the CEE process is rigorous, transparent, minimizes bias, and you can have a strong confidence in the results that you do get. But the challenges are that they do take a long time to complete, and it's a fairly high cost. And there's a lack of quality in the published science, which we saw, Andrew does assess in his CSAT tool, that unfortunately that's a problem. And the access to gray literature and engagement of practitioners in getting some of the reports, the gray literature that's not available online is still a challenge. But as you see in this session, we've actually now proactively initiated systematic reviews. There are some real concrete steps happening in terms of improving the monitoring and reporting standards so that we can improve the quality and accessibility of the data that's produced from all of the ad hoc experiments that happen across the country. And some of the systematic reviews presented here could form the basis of future processes. And with that, I'll take some questions.
Thanks, Karen. So it doesn't look like we have any questions at this time, although I'm just scanning one more time. But perhaps because a lot of what you've talked about at the end of this presentation here focused on sort of advantages and challenges of using systematic reviews in a science advisory process, some additional questions might come up in the panel discussion, so we can deal with those then.
Okay, thank you. All right, well now I would like to introduce our next speaker. It's Dr. Amanda Weingardner, and she will be joined by Alex DePaiva. Amanda is a senior science advisor with the Environment and Biodiversity Science branch out of Ottawa, and Alex is a policy analyst with the Ecosystems Management Policy and Practices branch out of Ottawa from the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. So they will be talking today about the use of systematic reviews and science advice in policy and decision-making, examples from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks, Karen. So as Karen mentioned, I'm from the science sector here in DFO, and my colleague Alex, who will be giving half of this presentation, is from one of the science sector's client sectors, so the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. And most of the presentations you've heard so far today have really focused on systematic reviews and explaining those. And so to sort of end off this first part of the panel, or the first part of this session, what we want to talk about is some examples where we've had science advice, both from evidence syntheses such as systematic reviews and other types of syntheses that have had strong policy uptake, and talk about some of our reflections related to those. So I'll let Alex explain a little bit about the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program first.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so just to provide a brief overview of the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program. So the program is predominantly responsible for administering the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection provisions of the Fisheries Act. So this is really the key legislative basis for the conservation and protection of fish and fish habitat under this piece of legislation. And included within the Act and within these provisions is several prohibitions that are meant to help protect and conserve fish and fish habitat, including prohibition against causing death of fish by means other than fishing, prohibition against causing any harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish and fish habitat. And then also, it also includes a framework for guiding the minister in making their decisions as it pertains to fish and fish habitat. So to help with the administration of these provisions, the program has various sort of regulatory tools available that allow us to help work with people proposing projects that might cause harm to fish and fish habitat, to identify avoidance measures, to identify mitigation measures, and to ultimately allow projects to go forward in a way that reduces the impact to fish and fish habitat. So here in this, what we call the house diagram, we have the various aspects of the programs. There's regulatory and enforcement branches, there's integrated planning branches, we have groups responsible for monitoring compliance and developing a public registry, and then also engagement, so establishing, consultation, outreach, partnerships with other organizations. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Amanda.
So the science sector at DFO has a long history of supporting the FFHPP or its earlier iterations. And you can see here a list on this slide of just some examples of topics that the science sector has provided science advice on in the past. And the science advice for these different topics would have come through a variety of different types of literature syntheses. So systematic reviews, but also meta-analyses and more traditional forms of literature review. And the thing that we sort of want to talk about is the fact that once the science advice is given, in some cases we don't have a good idea of how that advice is then used or implemented within policy and decision making. And we're trying to do some more work to sort of quantify and figure out uptake of different pieces of science advice. But in the meantime, we have some reflections for you based on conversations with colleagues and understanding of tracking science advice through different types of decision making and policy generation. So one example we want to talk about is a 2013 Science Advisory Report, or SAR, that was produced through the Canadian Science Advisory process that Karen outlined in the previous presentation. And this one focused on assessing ecological flow requirements to support fisheries in Canada. It was a piece of science advice that provided technical guidance on assessing the impacts of flow alteration on fisheries. And it's one that's had a very high level of uptake and use by various habitat biologists in different regions across DFO, particularly those that work in the hydroelectric and flows group within the FFHPP. So people that are interested in understanding how should they assess projects that alter flow regimes in rivers. And one thing that was really interesting about this particular piece of science advice is that the review and the resulting research document and advice that came from it had very specific thresholds for habitat biologists to consider when they have to make decisions about cumulative flow alterations. So there were numbers and thresholds that they could really point to from that advice and use for their decision making. Now Alex will talk about some other examples.
Thanks. So for this next example, rather than focusing on one individual sort of piece of science advice that we received as a program, figured it'd be good to actually look at a whole suite of different science advisory processes that we worked on with sort of the science sector and the program side. In particular, this one is around changes to the 2012 Fisheries Act. So during this time, the way that the program was assessing habitat or assessing projects fundamentally changed, and it shifted away from just a view on habitat towards a view on being able to identify what the impact to productivity to fisheries is as associated with that habitat loss. So it was a little bit of a change, and as a result, there was a lot of advisory processes that were undertaken to help the program in better meeting these legal obligations. In particular, there was processes around, how do we interpret certain terminology of the Act? How do we assess the productivity of fisheries? And also, how do we understand the linkage between habitat loss that might occur because of a project that occurs, in or near water, and the productivity that might have on fisheries productivity? So this actually helped feed into a whole series of policy updates, regulatory tool updates that were required in order to meet our new legal obligations. So some of the success factors, and some of these are also challenges as well, had to do with things like the timeframes for production of science advice. In this particular instance, there was very short timeframes associated with the advice, and in many situations that posed a challenge. However, where there was a longer time frame and earlier collaboration between science sector and management groups, the advice oftentimes had better uptake within the actual policy and regulatory tool development. Second being top-down motivation for policy development. So this is really about, was there a clear objective? And in this instance, it was clear on both the management side and on the science side how science advice was going to be integrated into revised policy tools, regulatory tools, decision-making. So that was actually a very huge success factor. And then finally, whether or not there was the availability of information. As Amanda mentioned, one of the interesting things about the flows CSAS that she talked about was that available information allowed for very concise thresholds to be established, and that had really strong uptake. Whereas where there's lower information, oftentimes the advice isn't quite as prescriptive, which is a bit of a challenge from the management perspective and integrating it into decision making. Go to the next slide. So for this third example, taking another look at sort of a suite of science advisory processes, and this is around ecologically and biologically significant areas. So under the former Oceans Act, DFO could establish areas based on ecological and biological significance and include an additional layer of management protection for that area to sort of help with conservation and protection objectives. And it was very clear from the outset, both on the management side and on the science side, that this really had to be grounded in science. How we establish a criteria around what is ecologically and biologically significant really does need to be science-based. And so there's a lot of work between the two groups in identifying and establishing criteria for what makes something ecologically and biologically significant. What is the role of management and what is the role of science, identifying prospective sites for EBSAs, and what layers of sort of additional, I guess, management options could be imposed on those areas to better improve the outcome. So some of the success factors here, again, is very clear objectives. It was very clear what the end goal was or what the end state was and how science advice would help to guide that. But one of the more interesting things I found about this sort of suite of science advisory processes that occurred was actually a very clear identification of the role of science and the role of management sectors within this process and in using that advice, which I found was really helpful in terms of the actual end result, the end uptake. So this is particularly interesting because currently right now within the Fish and Fish Habitat Protection Program, we're doing a little bit of a review for establishing ecologically significant areas under the Fisheries Act, which is again, another regulatory tool that we can use to increase protections for an area. And a lot of the science advice that was used for ecologically and biologically significant areas is actually being pulled directly into the ESA criteria, which is quite interesting because it was still useful then, and moving forward right now, because of those success factors, it is again being employed in our current regulatory work.
Okay, and just to summarize, so as Alex mentioned, oftentimes when we're going from a piece of science advice into something that will be used for decision making or policy, many of the things that might be success factors can also be challenges. And for example, as Alex mentioned, we've found that more prescriptive science advice is often more helpful to managers, but of course, sometimes that has the effect of including some of the caveats or uncertainty around the science advice. And so that's something that has to be taken into consideration. But just to give you a sort of an idea, for examples where we've seen where there's been science advice produced by the science sector that's had strong uptake by programs such as the FFHPP, there tends to be characteristics where advice is very clear, concise, and often prescriptive. There's also been an understanding between the two different sectors of what the questions are and what those questions mean. The timelines for the science advice are set up in such a way that there's enough time to ensure that adequate research can be done before the advice is produced. And there's been a very clear outlining of the role of both science and the role of the client sector or the recipient of the advice in the advisory process. And we just want to highlight that we have a lot of ongoing work that's happening between the science sector at DFO and the FFHPP, especially on programs such as our Freshwater Habitat Science Initiative, have clear communication and understanding of science advice requests so that we can have these types of processes that are really successful in generating advice that is useful for management. And with that, we'll answer any questions, and our contact information is here if you want to reach out afterwards.
Thanks, Amanda. There actually are a couple of questions. So this one may not be directly relevant, but you might have some insights. For evidence synthesis, such as presented today, when it bridges with government agencies for policy support, etc., is it considered interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research?
Ooh, I think that's a really good question. And I know that there's some nuances of those two different definitions that would probably need to be explored. So might have to take that one and sort of come back. But I guess just to say that I think in terms of the science sector, while we do try to have a lot of emphasis on not working in silos and making sure there's integration across different fields, there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I think often we're sort of working more in an interdisciplinary way where there's some interchange between two fields, but not really an integration of different methods used in different fields. And I think that we get more sort of a transdisciplinary nature. But we can dig in a little bit more to that question, perhaps come back with a longer answer.
Sounds good. And try to quickly, are there CSAS evaluations that are identified to be repeated over time as new evidence and methods become available? For example, updating EBSAs, etc.
Yeah, so Alex, feel free to jump in here if you want, but there are, for example, in stock assessment, there are advisory processes that are repeated in order to provide updates either on a yearly basis or sometimes on a different frequency. For ones that would more relate to habitat, for example, for FFHPP, in general, those ones don't have like a specific update schedule. Or although I think there have been cases where there have been advisory processes that have been not repeated, but have pulled in additional information later to provide sort of a more full picture. But outside of the stock assessment ones, I think generally there's not like a set update schedule that occurs.
Okay. Well, thank you, Amanda. Well, that concludes our presentations for this morning. Thank you to all the speakers. I think we did a great job. We're going to have a quick break now. So I have 11:49 a.m. Eastern time. So if we could just please take 5 minutes and we can come back at 11:54 and we will start with the panel session. So I ask, please, attendees, don't actually log off. Just it seems that some have had issues joining the session all at once. So just go take your break and we'll start again in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So it's 11:55 now, and so we're going to move to the next part of this session. I see most people have stayed online, so that's really great. We hope that you've enjoyed the presentations that were presented earlier. At the end of this, we will be putting up a slide with everyone's contact information. So if you had a question that you didn't have answered, you can reach out to folks directly. And then for those other questions that we've said, we'll look for an answer offline. We'll try and follow up with you. So we're going to move into our panel discussion. And the focus of this panel is really on the benefits and challenges encountered that may influence the use of contemporary evidence synthesis in the Canadian federal government. And we have 4 panelists, and I'm going to invite them to turn on their webcams if you're comfortable with that. And I'll introduce everyone. So we've got one person so far with their webcam on. Hopefully we can get others. Great, thank you. Okay, awesome. Okay, so we have 4 panelists today, and in a minute I'll be turning off my webcam, so you'll just have the 4 of them on your screen. And we also have a slide showing here with some questions that we're going to be walking through. So I'm just going to do some introductions, explain how this panel works, and then I'll be turning it over to our panelists. And we have about the next half hour for this segment. So I'll do a little introduction, and maybe you can just wave when I say your name. So joining us on this panel, we have Trina Rutwinski, and Trina is a research associate with the Center for Evidence-Based Conservation and Management. She did a presentation earlier in the session. We have Kent Pryor, and Kent is a national manager for ecosystem conservation at Parks Canada, and he is based in Gatineau. We have Jerome Marty, and Jerome is a project director at the Council of Canadian Academies. And so he's going to be able to share some views based on his past and current experiences, and also has an outside government perspective, which is really great. And we have Sophie Foster, and Sophie is a national manager in the ecosystems and ocean science sector based here at DFO in Ottawa. And in normal times, one of my cubicle mates, but unfortunately not right now. So Jerome, Kent, Trina, Sophie, thank you so much for joining us. For the audience, how this is going to work is there's a number of questions that are here on the screen that you can see. And this set of 8 questions we gave to the panelists ahead of time and asked them to choose one that really spoke to them, that they thought would be interesting for them to answer. And so everyone's chosen a question. And so what we'll do is we'll have each panelist unmute themselves. And if you want to say anything else about your intro, feel free. If you have any sort of comments on any of the presentations or any sort of reflections that you've had after seeing those presentations, please feel free to start with those. And then you can walk us through sort of your main response to the question that you've chosen, and I'll read those out for folks before we start. And then if there are any other questions that anyone has from the audience, we'll go through those and have a bit of an exchange. So I'm going to turn off my webcam now, so it's just everyone here. And we're going to have, I think we'll start with Trina. So Trina, if you want to unmute yourself and feel free to give any comments on the presentations and then walk through the question that you were answering.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. First, I'd just like to say we're experiencing a thunderstorm right now. So if I lose internet, I apologize. I don't have any comments from the presentations that were just happened. I would just like to say that I thank you for Amanda and Karen for organizing this. I'm just glad we're having these discussions. This is wonderful. So the question I am addressing is the main limitations when it comes to using formal systematic literature reviews to summarize evidence for government decisions, and what can we really do about them. I believe there's 2 main limitations to using formal systematic reviews. The first one, but there are ways that we can kind of address those. Karen did talk about a few of them in her presentation. The first one that I'd like to talk about that she mentioned was that obviously the most obvious for most people is that they are resource intensive with respect to the amount of effort in terms of technical expertise that are required, the manpower and time, as well as the available fundings to actually undertake them. So from our experience with systematic reviews and systematic maps at the Center for Canadian evidence-based evidence conservation, they commonly take 2 to 3 years to complete, which is a typical time frame in comparison to other CE systematic reviews and systematic maps. Ours tend to be on more closer to the 3-year mark from kind of start to actual publication. But the time requirements are obviously very dependent on the size of the evidence base. The larger the evidence base, the more time it's going to take to get through that amount of information. But the good thing is that with any systematic review, for the most part, the time required to actually conduct that can be reduced depending on whether or not there's sufficient available funding. So you can throw more people and more funds to kind of speed up the process of a systematic review, especially in those more time-consuming stages such as article screening and data extraction and critical appraisal. So there definitely are ways to speed up the process, just if the available funds and expertise are available to do so. I think the thing to be careful about is when you add more people to a project to complete those tasks, there is a potential for consistency to go down in terms of those particular tasks. So just making sure that there's safeguards in place to make sure that everyone's on the same page about what's being included, what's being extracted is really important. And I think there's really excellent examples right now with COVID-19 of the fact that we're in short periods of time, we're having systematic reviews being pumped out relatively quickly because we need that information fast. And they're still being able to be done at a level of rigor that's important to have confidence in those conclusions. The second limitation that I believe is for systematic reviews, it's not really a limitation per se with the systematic review itself, but really the available evidence base to support the questions being asked by the systematic review. So the outcomes of a systematic review really depend entirely on the science or rigor of the available evidence base. So in an ideal world, we can have decisions supported by a large quantity of high validity studies. But in reality, it's not uncommon for a systematic review to conclude that the evidence base is too small, and that could be because there is really a lack of studies or because there's poor reporting. So we had to exclude a lot of studies because they're missing information in those studies. Or alternatively, you can have a really large evidence base, but it's based on kind of crappy data. So it's not really high validity. There's various biases, there's lack of replication, there's no comparators, for example. So there are issues. So if you take 2 to 3 years to complete a systematic review and really all you can come back with is providing guidance on how to improve the quality of primary research, it can be disappointing for funders, obviously, because they still need to make decisions, right? And I'm not saying all systematic reviews, that's the case. That there's definitely examples of systematic reviews that produce really, you have high quality data with large amounts of evidence. But in our experience, for some of our systematic reviews, they're really relatively small. So what can be done about that? This one's a bit tricky. I mean, the evidence base is the evidence base, and you've got to kind of make the best of it. What we're trying to do and trying to build appreciation for kind of at the beginning of the process is to try to do a more rigorous scoping exercise. So with all CE kind of focused reviews, you have to do an initial scoping exercise. You're testing the search string. So you want to make sure you're capturing everything. It's comprehensive but precise. But we're hoping to maybe take that a little bit further if there's time available, to maybe take 1 or 2 months and do the searches, but then take a subset of that data and try to gauge of that subset how many would actually be included, how many contain quantitative data that can be included in the meta-analysis, and what's the level of study validity, and then try to extrapolate that out to the evidence base to kind of get a relative kind of estimate of the available evidence. Would a systematic review be possible with a meta-analysis, for example? I think there's also, that's at the front end. So that's to kind of, address that limitation at the front end. But what happens if you actually have a review that's already ongoing, or is at the tail end of it? So one recommendation, Karen touched upon this in her review, was that in her presentation, sorry, is to strive to go beyond a simple narrative synthesis. So attempt some form of analysis, as long as it's accompanied with a discussion of the limitations and the implications for the review findings. So as Karen mentioned, for one of our systematic reviews on offsets, we did a full systematic review, a formal systematic review, where we included only medium and high quality studies. But then we also did an accompanying report that looked at all of the evidence base, so the low, medium, and high quality, and did comparison of how do the review results compare between those two different subsets of the evidence base, if you will. So trying to go a little bit more beyond just a simple narrative, if that's all you can do, would be really helpful to make use of the available evidence. And other people have advocated for that as well. I think I'm probably over my 3 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Trina. And so just a reminder, if you have questions as panelists are speaking, please put them in the question pane so that we can get to those. I think I'll turn now to Kent. So Kent, you were going to talk a little bit about how we increase the use of formal evidence syntheses in government decisions.
That's right. Thanks, Amanda. Hope everyone can hear me. I just want to thank Amanda and Karen for organizing this session and inviting me, and for Steve Cook and his group for scrambling so effectively when we knew that the summit was canceled in its original form. Glad to be here today. I've prepared a few remarks, responses, I guess, to the question, how can we increase the use of formal evidence syntheses in government decisions? I'll say first off that I learned a lot during the presentations, and so some of my answers or responses to this question are perhaps now out of date. And I'll also say that the work that we do in Parks Canada is considerably behind some of the advanced work that has been done or is being done within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, where Karen and Amanda work. So how can we increase the use of formal evidence syntheses in government decisions? I've got 5 sort of practical observations that I've come up with here. Number 1 is spread the love. If you want evidence syntheses to catch fire in your organization, it will take more than you to get on board with the idea that they're worth the effort. You can't be the only one convinced that they could be useful in government decision making. Ideally, you'll need other converts or disciples to surround you in the hierarchy of your org chart. Those enlightened colleagues should include senior managers above you, peers around you, and workmates at your side. Second observation or suggestion is that we assemble relevant examples. To help convince government colleagues of the merits of evidence syntheses for decision making, we need a diversity of relevant practical examples. Where has the use of evidence syntheses actually made a difference? Where specifically has our experience with evidence syntheses either saved time, saved money, saved effort, and most importantly, led to effective environmental remedies? I don't believe that we have these stories at least readily available at our fingertips. Without them, evidence syntheses can seem to some like distracting smoke and mirrors, cerebral exercises. Number 3, make syntheses accessible. Ramping up the use of evidence syntheses will require ready access to topic-specific evidence summaries. So where can my Parks Canada colleagues go to find out whether evidence syntheses exist to help inform decisions that we need to make? I'm not entirely sure if the places I would search are the best, though we heard about CEDAR today from Andrew, and so that's great that that's up and running or coming online. But I suspect that in advance of that presentation by Andrew, if we took a poll of the audience right now, we'd get a very diverse set of answers. Ideally, we'd be able to just go to CEDAR and find the answers that we need pertaining to the existence of certified, readable, and usable syntheses for the topic of interest. Number 4 is that we should find a way to ensure that syntheses are fresh. Again, other speakers have touched on this, but we need to be able to trust that evidence syntheses are current. If they're out of date because they've not incorporated recent findings, then stated conclusions could be in error. And I believe there's been some research done looking at whether or not evidence syntheses conclusions flip over time. But maybe there should be, perhaps at CEDAR, sort of a clearinghouse process by which the relative freshness of syntheses are regularly validated and the currency certified. And the final point I'd suggest pertaining to this question of advancing the use of evidence syntheses in a government decision making is that you as practitioners within government should bake syntheses into your business. Don't hold your breath waiting for the long promised overarching government-wide or departmental level policy to materialize. When and if it does, I anticipate that that policy on evidence syntheses in government decisions will be less instructive than we might hope for. I suspect it will be simply enabling, which is okay, but it's not especially instructive. Rather, sooner than later, you should ingrain the use of evidence syntheses into your own business practices and workflows. Where appropriate, make evidence syntheses a basic requirement of projects or programs that you have control over or influence over. Lead by example, don't wait for direction. Share the lessons and insights of this ground floor work that you're doing. And if it works out to the benefit of good decisions and others recognize those gains, then the practice is likely to catch on and the policy might follow. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Kent. We do have some questions coming in already, but I'll just finish off with sort of these opening remarks by panelists before we get to those. So Sophie, I thought we could move to you and you could talk a little bit more about mechanisms that are available or exist that might be necessary to translate science advice into policy or decision making. Oh, sorry, Sophie, I'm having a bit of problem hearing you. Okay, yeah, maybe try with the webcam off. Okay. Sophie, can you try and say something now? We'll see if we can hear you, okay? Okay. Sophie, apologies. I can't hear you. I'm not sure if others can. No, I'm seeing some shaking heads. Okay, so we'll come back. Why don't we move to Jerome and then we'll come back in a few minutes and hopefully the problem will have disappeared. That's my answer to all tech issues. So Jerome, if we could just move to you to start. And so the question we had put to you were, what are other ways of summarizing evidence besides formal systematic literature reviews for decision making, and what are the benefits and drawbacks of each?
All right, can you hear me well?
I can, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, very good. Well, first, thank you very much as well to the organizers, and to be able to relaunch an event that is canceled is always a big task. So it's been really good. I've really appreciated the presentations this morning. As you mentioned, Amanda, I'm now outside of the government. I had the chance to taste a little bit what the DFO CSAS process is, and was actually part of 2 of those. And I am now at the CCA, the Council of Canadian Academies, who is really trying to do its best to answer questions, evidence-based material collection, synthesis, to answer questions that are coming mostly from the federal government. What I liked in the previous presentation, so I took a few notes, things that I would like to highlight very quickly. I really appreciated that for Stephen Alexander, for example, the need to look at outside of the Western science box. And I appreciate very much the term bridging, which definitely didn't exist even maybe 4 or 5 years ago in most of the government literature. So looking at indigenous knowledge, but not just indigenous, but also local knowledge. I would add that ILK is probably a more comprehensive forms of knowledge. And we had Andrew. I really like the CEDAR presentation because it provides new tools. I think we're making great progresses with new innovative ways of making synthesis, and the evidence-based synthesis is one of them. The presentations from Mike Jones highlighted the need to engage with stakeholders, and that's where I am going to go with my answer. Using a bit of spread the love from Kent, that is about people. The love is provided by people, and to reconnect between the knowledge, the things that we need to consider to answer a particular issue or gap, and the people that are providing that knowledge, and the people that are using that knowledge. So my question was about the other ways of summarizing evidence. So to answer that question, I had to think a little bit about why are we summarizing the evidence and for what purpose? And to me, it's about the answering or understanding the decision making is for what purposes. And I can see three main streams, and they are probably incomplete, but they are the ones that are required for the policy for regulation, I would call. And I think we had a number of examples. DFO, I think, has provided a lot of really good work on flow regimes, how to implement Fisheries Act. So these are really needs to address specific regulations within particular acts or pieces of legislation. Then we have, and I added that one, we have the policy for emergent issues and emergency, and we are very much into a sphere now where we don't have time to look at all the evidences. And I think, Trina, you gave that example that we do have the new methods, systematic approaches that are helpful for COVID, for example. And this is really a new ways, and it calls for new ways to collect the information, because we have to realize that we have to make a decision very quickly, and we won't necessarily have a comprehensive knowledge about the issue. And there are risks associated with that. We can be wrong. And the last bucket, and that's the bucket where I fall in now, is about the larger policy issues that directs government priorities and directions. A few years ago, the CCA provided a review of what are the top 40 priorities for ocean science in Canada. And these are to compile the information for this type of synthesis. It goes beyond one particular field. It's a multidisciplinary approach, and it's also an approach that requires multiple types of people at the table. It's about Western science, it's about social science, and now as we moved into a model where we are now looking at a more comprehensive set of knowledge, it includes Indigenous and local knowledge. So some of the questions that fall into that bucket, I identify the priorities for ocean science. It doesn't fall necessarily in one particular legislations, but it does provide the department with a direction. This is what we decide to take on as a long-term goal or direction. So the work that I have the opportunity to do at the CCA is a kind of a hybrid model. I think we do the classic literature review, but we do those using experts. And this is where the people sides, the who, comes in. And I think we've learned quite a bit that by having people at the table to provide their knowledge, we benefit from their personal expertise, but also from their broader knowledge, so what they've accomplished themselves and the state of knowledge in a particular discipline. So the synthesis in cases like that are triggered by individuals, and that is, I think, a big difference between what we have with a systematic review process or a traditional review process. What are the pros and cons for this type of models? I will start with the benefits. We have access, I mentioned, to a broader knowledge, different fields of science, social science, and others. We probably reduce some of the barriers associated with sharing the knowledge. And one of the presentation today mentioned the gray literature, and I think it's a great concern within governments. There is so much literature that stays within departments, and we never hear about it. And there are sometimes cases where that information is confidential. There are some cases where there are no reasons sometimes not to share it, but there is no mechanism for sharing. So when we have access to people, then they may know about these reports. And the current work that I do on the circular economy for Environment Canada, we knew about some reports that were not public that are really going to be helpful for us to answer the question. I would like also to say that by having people and talking about barriers to accessing knowledge, when we talk about indigenous knowledge, I've learned that with the recent policy policing report, is that all knowledge is not necessarily shareable, and we have to acknowledge that. It's really important that we recognize that as part of the process, we are trying to bridge the knowledge. But to bridge the knowledge, we take the assumptions that the knowledge is actually bridgeable. And for some knowledge, it is not. And we have to really make sure that we recognize that some knowledge everyone will have access to, and we can find ways of working that knowledge together, bridging the knowledge, but not everything is going to be shareable. And that is a problem, because governments will need to make decisions that are informed. They will need to back up their decisions by the knowledge, and sometimes they won't have access to all of it. And I think it's a challenge and something that at the same time needs to be recognized. Another advantage or benefits is that it allows for what I would call disruption thinking, and something that may not happen or appear very easily if you just look at what's in the literature, what is, and whatever approach you take. If you have individual in the room, they may actually, it may spark something that is going to lead to something that is greater than the sum of the parts. And I believe we can achieve that greater level of knowledge and new knowledge by interacting with people that can come together and then digest, cook all that knowledge to provide something that is new and that could be disruptive in some cases. Some of the disadvantages about engaging with experts is that, well, the outcome depends really on who is in the room, the number of people that are involved. I think it's true for some of the CSAS reports. The expertise is the expertise that is in the room, and it's true for our expert panel as well. So the number of participants is very important, but also the way we select and we ask people to contribute. It's really important to have a strong, a very solid process on how do we weave all that knowledge of people together. And there is a lot to be said about just how to select experts to make sure we have all the facets of a particular questions that is being covered. There is always a potential. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Jerome. Because we don't have that much time left, and I just want to make sure there's some time to address a question that we received.
All right.
From the audience. So thank you.
Okay, that's fine.
So I have 3 questions that have come in, and I'm going to read all 3 of them, and then perhaps if anyone has a particular one that they think that they could answer, we'll jump into that. So, and any of the ones we don't get to, we can try and get answers after. So one is specifically sort of more to Trina, and this one is, given the resource and evidence-based limitations of systematic reviews, are traditional narrative reviews more valuable than systematic reviews in certain contexts? So that's one question. Another question, and this one is specifically at Jerome. Could you give 1 or 2 examples of what kind of knowledge would not be shareable? So are you talking about confidential data, specific data types, or lack of data integration? Mm-hmm. And one other question, as someone from outside of Canada, I'm ignorant of the structure of natural resource agencies within the Canadian government. There were speakers from DFO. Can someone speak at a high level to whether evidence syntheses are used, applied evenly across the Canadian Natural Resource Agencies, or mainly concentrated within DFO? So perhaps Kent could respond to that. And there are some other questions coming in, but I think that's all we'll have time for. So maybe we can start with Trina and then go to Jerome and Kent. And then I'll have a few notes from Sophie to pass on at the very end. And then if you could try and keep your responses very brief for these questions.
Okay, great. Thanks for that question. I think there may be situations where a narrative review might be more appropriate than a systematic review, in situations where the evidence base may be of all low quality studies, and you can't actually conduct a systematic review to kind of the rigorous standards of CE, in the sense that, you know, all you're left with would be low quality studies. But I still think we should be striving to follow as closely as possible those guidelines, because they're there for a reason, to be transparent, to be able to reproduce the work as well. So there's definitely situations where I think an attempt to follow as closely as possible those guidelines by CE, even if you're doing a narrative review, would be helpful. But I think there's also opportunity to also do some sort of hybrid. And I think we're looking into doing some of that as well, where you do what you can with what you have, in terms of, if you have a subset of the data that's higher, medium quality or validity, you can do a systematic review based on that. And then if there's species-specific questions or regional questions that you can kind of dig a little bit deeper into, that might be policy relevant, if there's specific policy relevant questions, then you can maybe dig a little bit deeper on a subset, and do a little bit more of an in-depth narrative that way. I think that would definitely be helpful.
Great, thanks, Trina. So then we'll move to Kent.
Sure. So I guess the third question was someone from outside of Canada, and I guess the short answer is that no, there isn't any sort of overarching guidance that applies to all federal government departments or agencies like Parks Canada. There is the SAGE principles that I think either Karen or Amanda shared in one of their presentations earlier. I do believe that the Chief Science Advisor's office is preparing, again, this sort of like chapeau or umbrella policy that will afford direction to government departments, writ large, but it's still a work in progress. I might be wrong about that, so if this is a question that we want to address, more succinct terms and correctly down the road, perhaps Karen or others could chime in or contribute, written answers. Thanks.
Thanks, Kent. And so, Jerome, I'll give you 1 minute to answer that last question, and then we're going to see if Sophie's audio will work, just to give her sort of the final word. And then, like Kent says, I think we'll try and follow up with some written responses to some of these other questions. So, Jerome?
Yeah, some examples of information that is not easily shareable. I would say everything that touched to cultural knowledge, traditional sites, sacred sites. There are evidences that some species distributions, especially for SAR species, are not always shared by First Nations, depending on locations. They keep that knowledge for themselves, and there are good reasons for that. Trust is one. There are also some knowledge about migrations of species that is not always known. I'm thinking about caribous, for example, in the Northwest Territories or Northern Canada. Two examples where we saw that. There is the vulnerability assessments for oil spills on the coast of BC, where we did see that the First Nations wanted to keep the knowledge on some of the ecological vulnerabilities, and that is an example. And the second one is one ongoing health reports for the St. Lawrence River, where we are for the first time working with the Mohawk community, and they are actually mapping, they're using Western approaches to map some of their knowledge that was never shared before, but they do ask for a particular format on the way the information is shared. And I hope that's 1 minute.
Thanks, Jerome. Sophie, if you could try your audio, we could give the final word to you if there's anything that you wanted to comment on for any of those questions or your sort of opening question.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we can.
I came off my headphones. So, I mean, I was going to go through a little bit more and provide some more context on the Canadian Science Advisory process, but Karen and Amanda and Alex provided a little bit. I think something that I was going to emphasize was the conversation that happens between the managers
that are asking a question and the scientists who are kind of responding to the questions, and the importance of that relationship, which is built within fisheries and oceans, and a kind of a common understanding of what the managers are trying to achieve, and how they're going to be using the process, and how that's used to develop the terms of reference for the specific advisory process. And then those terms of reference are used to kind of define what science is providing to the managers. And then the science provide that information through a science advisory report. But that's not always enough, that it's part of an iterative conversation, and sometimes it needs to kind of have that discussion after the fact and build on previous advice. So maybe that's all I'll say. And Amanda, maybe you could distribute the notes that I had previously, that might help. If I've missed anything, that those might help kind of strengthen that. But open for any kind of questions offline as well.
Yes, thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Sophie, and apologies for those audio issues. But yes, so we have received sort of the written notes from a number of panelists, and so I think we'll probably look at maybe distributing those and trying to, with permission, so we'll follow up on that and try to answer some of these questions that we couldn't answer. So thank you. So thank you for this panel. I think that the fact that we ran out of time and went over a little bit of time is a good indication that there's lots to say on this topic, and there's lots of really great questions. So thanks you, everyone. Jess, is there anything that you wanted to say sort of at the end here?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on quickly to thank everyone for joining today. I know there may have been some issues with everyone joining all at once, and it seemed like the session was full. We just had quite a few people joining at the same time, so hopefully that was sorted. Just a reminder that this will be a monthly series over the next year or so, as we had about 10 sessions that were supposed to be here in Ottawa in June. So the next one is evidence synthesis technology. So that'll be held September 8th, 6 a.m. EST. I know it's a little early for some of us North Americans, but we do have a global community, so we're trying to manage that. All of the sessions will be recorded and posted online. You'll get a follow-up email, I think in about 24 hours or so, with some important links and some information on where you can find those recordings. And then if you have any questions or want to be added to our mailing list, that information will be there as well. So thanks again for sticking around. And if you have any questions, please just feel free to follow up and we will send some more information out. And thanks to Karen and Amanda for leading this. It was a great first session.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.